You did everything right. You built a life that works. You have conversations. You show up when expected. You maintain the rhythm. From the outside, nothing is missing. And yet, there is a quiet sense that something is off. Not strong enough to call a problem. Not clear enough to explain. Just a low, steady distance. You notice it in small moments. When a conversation ends, and something in you doesn't fully register it. When you laugh, but the feeling arrives a fraction too late. When you're surrounded by people, and still something in you remains untouched. You notice it, then you explain it. You tell yourself this is normal. People get busy. Connections change. Depth fades. This is just how it feels. And for a while, that explanation holds. Until it doesn't. Because the feeling doesn't behave like fatigue. It doesn't disappear when you rest. It doesn't resolve when you're alone. In fact, it becomes more visible in silence. You sit with yourself, expecting relief, and instead, you feel something missing. Not people, something else, something internal, something you can't quite name. So you compensate. You reach for something. Your phone, a distraction, a small interruption. Not because you need it, because silence reveals something you don't want to look at directly. And the strange part is, you don't call this loneliness. Because loneliness, in your mind, is clear. It means isolation. No one around. No one to talk to. That's not your situation. You have people. You have interaction. You have contact. So this can't be loneliness. That's the assumption. But that assumption is the first mistake. Because what you're experiencing is not the absence of people. It is the absence of connection, where connection should exist. It is interaction without contact. You can speak without being seen. You can listen without being affected. You can exist in constant communication and still remain internally untouched. This is the quiet form, the version that doesn't look like a problem, the version that hides inside normal life, and because it doesn't get named, it doesn't get questioned. So you adjust. You normalize it. You build your life around it. You stay slightly occupied, slightly distracted, slightly engaged. Enough to function, not enough to feel fully connected. And over time, this becomes your baseline. You stop expecting depth. You stop looking for it. You stop believing it's even available. And that is where the shift happens. Not when you become lonely, but when you begin to organize your life around not noticing it. Because at that point, the feeling is no longer temporary. It becomes structural, part of how you relate, part of how you experience yourself. And that is the pattern. By the end of this, you'll understand why you can be surrounded by people and still feel untouched. You'll see what this distance actually is, how it forms, and what it quietly takes from you over time. But you should know this now. What this points to is not comfortable, because the real question isn't whether this distance is there. The question is whether you're willing to stop adjusting around it and finally look at how you've been maintaining it. You think the problem is that something is missing, that you haven't found the right people, the right environment, the right kind of connection. That's not the pattern. The pattern is not absence. It is distance, a specific kind of distance, one that you are maintaining without noticing. You enter conversations, but only partially. You reveal things, but not the parts that matter. You stay present, but not exposed. And because of that, something important never happens. Contact. Real contact requires risk, not social risk. Psychological risk. Letting something real in you be seen before you've controlled how it will be received. You avoid that moment, not consciously, automatically. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. You interpret this as being private, as being selective, as having boundaries. But that's not what this is. This is controlled exposure. You decide what version of yourself enters the interaction. You adjust tone, you adjust intensity, you adjust depth. You present something that can be accepted, not something that is fully real. And because of that, you never actually test whether you can be met. You only test whether your edited version can be received. And when that version is accepted, it doesn't satisfy you, because it wasn't you. So the interaction completes, but the connection doesn't register. And you're left with a familiar feeling. I was there, but not really. This is the architecture. It repeats everywhere, with friends, with family, with people who are trying to get closer to you. You let them approach, but only to a certain distance. After that point, something in you stabilizes the space, keeps things predictable, controlled, safe, and shallow. This is not a personality trait. It is a structure, a way of relating that prioritizes control over contact. Carl Jung described something close to this. He called it the persona, the version of you that learns how to function socially, the part that adapts, adjusts, presents. It is necessary. You need it to exist in the world, but you are not supposed to live inside it. You are supposed to use it. Instead, it has become your primary interface, not just in public, but in private, not just with strangers, but with people who are close to you. And when the persona becomes dominant, something very specific happens. You remain socially present, but psychologically absent. You appear connected, but internally, you are not participating. And over time, this creates a gap between the self that is expressed and the self that is experienced. That gap is what you feel. You call it emptiness, distance, disconnection. But it is more precise than that. It is the result of being present in form and absent in substance. And the more this repeats, the more stable it feels. Until one day, you stop seeing it as a pattern. You see it as yourself. But this is only the structure. To understand it, you have to see how it operates. You don't experience this pattern as distance. You experience it as normal behavior. That's why it's difficult to see, because nothing about it looks extreme. It shows up in small adjustments, micro decisions, almost invisible shifts in how you respond. Someone asks you a question, a real one, not logistical, something about how you feel, and you notice a pause. Not outside, inside, a quick scan. What version of the truth is acceptable here? Not a lie, not even a full distortion, just selection. You remove the part that feels too exposed. You soften the edge. You translate something real into something manageable, and the conversation continues, smoothly, comfortably, without friction, without consequence, but also without contact. This happens constantly. You speak, but you are monitoring yourself while speaking. You listen, but part of you is preparing the next response. You react, but only within a controlled range. Nothing moves too far. Nothing reveals too much. And because of that, nothing reaches you either. You become highly functional in interaction. You know how to maintain flow. You know how to keep things engaging. You know how to avoid awkward silence. You know how to say the right thing at the right time. But underneath all of that, something is missing. Participation, not physical, psychological. You are there, but not affected. And that changes everything. Because connection is not built through interaction. It is built through mutual impact, through being altered, even slightly, by the presence of another person. You avoid that. Again, not consciously, but consistently. And over time, this avoidance creates a very specific experience. You begin to feel like interactions are repetitive, predictable, surface level. You start to believe that people are limited, that conversations don't go deep, that connection is rare. But what you're actually experiencing is the result of your own filtering, because you are not entering fully. And there is another layer to this, one that is even less visible. You don't just filter what you express, you filter what you feel. Certain emotions don't get full access. Certain reactions get reduced before they even form. You interrupt yourself internally before anything becomes too real, too intense, too revealing. And because of that, your emotional experience becomes muted, not absent, just flattened. Less variation, less depth, less impact, which leads to a very specific conclusion. Something must be wrong with me. I don't feel things the way I should. I'm disconnected, but that conclusion is inaccurate. This is not an emotional deficiency. This is emotional regulation taken too far. Not regulation for balance. Regulation for control. You are not lacking feeling. You are limiting access to it. And that limitation extends outward. Because the less you feel internally, the less you connect externally. The less you connect externally, the more you rely on structure, on routine, on predictable interaction. And slowly, your life becomes efficient, stable, functioning, but internally, unchanged, unmoved, untouched. This is why the loneliness feels confusing. Because nothing is obviously wrong. Your life works. Your interactions work. Your routines work. But you don't feel connected to any of it. Not fully. And the more this repeats, the more natural it feels. Until, eventually, you stop expecting anything else. You accept a version of life where you are present, but not involved. Where you are engaged, but not affected. Where you are connected, but not touched. And that is where the real cost begins. At first, the cost is subtle, almost unnoticeable. You function, you maintain relationships, you move through your days without disruption. Nothing collapses. Nothing forces your attention. That's why it continues. But the cost is not immediate. It accumulates, quietly, over time. You begin to notice a certain sameness. Days feel interchangeable. Conversations blur together. Nothing leaves a strong imprint, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is reaching you deeply enough to register. You start to lose contrast. Experiences don't feel distinct. They feel processed, managed, filtered, and slowly, life becomes something you move through, rather than something you are inside of. There is another shift, more difficult to see. You begin to feel less pulled toward people, not because you don't care, but because the interactions don't satisfy anything real, so your motivation decreases. You withdraw slightly, not completely, just enough to protect your energy. You tell yourself you prefer solitude, that you're more comfortable alone, that most conversations are superficial anyway. And there is truth in that, but it is not the full truth. Because what you are actually avoiding is the effort of trying to connect while remaining hidden. That tension is exhausting. So you reduce exposure. You simplify your social world. Fewer people, fewer interactions, less unpredictability. And on the surface, this feels like clarity, like refinement. But underneath, something else is happening. Your world is shrinking, not physically, psychologically. Fewer points of contact, fewer opportunities to be affected, fewer chances for something real to break through your control. And as that space narrows, your inner experience becomes more contained, more repetitive, more isolated. You begin to rely more on internal stimulation, thoughts, distractions, controlled environments, because external life no longer provides enough impact. And this is where the deeper cost appears. You start to feel like you are living beside your life, observing it, managing it, but not fully inside it. Moments pass, and you register them intellectually. This should matter. This is important. This is meaningful. But the feeling doesn't match the recognition. So you compensate again. You try to intensify experiences. More content, more stimulation, more novelty. But intensity is not the solution, because the problem is not lack of input. It is lack of contact. And no amount of stimulation can replace that. Over time, this creates a very specific kind of fatigue, not physical, not even emotional in the usual sense. Existential, a sense that something essential is missing, but you can't locate where. You start to question things, your relationships, your interests, your direction. You wonder if you chose the wrong path, the wrong people, the wrong structure for your life. But the structure is not the issue. The issue is how you are inside it. You are moving through everything without letting anything move through you. And that has a consequence. You begin to lose a clear sense of yourself. Not your identity on paper, but your felt sense of being. What you actually feel, what actually matters, what actually affects you. Because if nothing is allowed to reach you fully, nothing defines you either. And that creates a subtle instability. You become adaptable, flexible, capable, but also ungrounded, undefined, easily shaped by context, because there is no strong internal reference point. And eventually, this leads to a more difficult realization. You are not just disconnected from others. You are disconnected from your own experience of life. And that is the deeper loneliness. Not the absence of people, the absence of participation, the absence of being reached, the absence of being changed. And if this continues long enough, it doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects what you believe is possible. You stop expecting depth. You stop expecting to be understood. You stop expecting to feel fully alive in your own life. Not because those things are unavailable, because you have adapted to a version of reality where they no longer occur. And once that belief settles, you don't try to change it. You maintain it. You protect it. You build your life around it. And that is how the pattern becomes permanent. Unless something interrupts it, unless something forces you to look at it directly. And that raises the more difficult question. Not what this is costing you now, but why this pattern formed in the first place. This didn't start as a problem. It started as an adaptation, a useful one. At some point, you learned something specific. Being fully present was not safe. Not physically unsafe, but psychologically unsafe. Too much exposure led to something: misunderstanding, rejection, dismissal, or something more subtle, a lack of response where there should have been one. You expressed something real, and it didn't land. It wasn't received. It wasn't recognized. So your system adjusted. Not dramatically, quietly. It learned to anticipate that gap. And to prevent it, instead of expressing fully, you began to regulate in advance. You shaped your responses before they left you. You filtered reactions before they became visible. You controlled how much of you entered the moment. And this worked. It reduced friction. It made interactions smoother, more predictable. You became easier to be around, more adaptable, more acceptable, and over time, this became automatic. You didn't think of it as protection. You thought of it as maturity, as emotional control, as social awareness. But underneath, the original reason remained. Avoid the moment where something real in you is not met. Avoid the experience of reaching and finding nothing there. So you stopped reaching fully, and instead, you began managing the distance. This is not a flaw. It is a learned structure, and it often begins early, in environments where emotional signals were inconsistent, where attention was unpredictable, where being understood was not reliable. You learn to read the room, to adjust, to stay within a range that keeps things stable, not because you want to hide, because it works, because it prevents something worse. Over time, this becomes your default way of relating, not just with others, but with yourself. You begin to treat your own inner experience the same way. You don't let feelings fully form. You interrupt reactions. You translate intensity into something manageable. You stay within a controlled range internally, just as you do externally. And eventually, you lose direct access to parts of yourself. Not because they disappeared, because they are no longer allowed to fully emerge. This is where Carl Jung becomes useful again. He describes something called the shadow, not as something dark or negative, but as everything that was pushed out of conscious expression, everything that didn't fit the version of you that learned how to function. Parts of you that were too intense, too vulnerable, too unpredictable, too real. So they were set aside, not removed, just not expressed. And when those parts remain unexpressed for long enough, they don't disappear. They become distant. They become unfamiliar. They feel less like you, which creates a strange experience. You begin to feel disconnected from yourself. You don't fully know what you feel. You don't fully trust your reactions. You don't fully recognize your own depth. And because of that, you stay within the range you understand, the controlled range, the manageable range, the acceptable range, and that keeps everything stable, but also incomplete. This is why the loneliness feels so difficult to explain, because it is not just about others. It is about access. Access to yourself. Access to your own emotional reality. Access to the parts of you that were set aside in order to function. And without that access, connection becomes limited. Because you cannot connect from parts of yourself you are not in contact with. So you do what you can. You connect from the surface, from what is available, from what is controlled, and it works, but it never satisfies. Because something essential is missing. Not outside, inside, and until that changes, the pattern repeats. No matter who enters your life, no matter what your external situation looks like, because the structure travels with you into every interaction, into every relationship, into every moment. And that leads to the only question that actually matters. Not how to find better connection, but how to return to the parts of yourself that make connection possible in the first place. The instinct is to fix this externally, to find better people, more depth, more honesty, more meaningful interaction. But that is not where this changes, because the structure you built will follow you into every situation. You can meet the right person and still remain partially absent. You can be in the right environment and still filter yourself. So the shift is not outward, it is inward, not dramatic, not immediate, but precise. It begins with something simple. You stop managing your experience quite so quickly. That moment when something real starts to form, a reaction, a feeling, an impulse to say something slightly more honest than usual. You notice it, and normally, you would adjust it, translate it, soften it, but instead, you pause, not to perfect it, to allow it. This is the first change. Not expression, but permission. You let the reaction exist internally, without immediately shaping it into something acceptable. And that alone will feel unfamiliar, because you are used to regulating before you experience. Now, you are allowing yourself to experience before regulating. And that changes your relationship to yourself. You begin to notice things more clearly, where you hold back, where you reduce intensity, where you disconnect mid-moment, not as a problem, as a pattern. This is where I usually step away. This is where I translate something real into something safe. This is where I disappear slightly. You don't force yourself to act differently yet. You observe it without interrupting the observation. And slowly, that awareness creates space. A small gap between the impulse to control and the act of controlling. And inside that gap, something new becomes possible. Choice. Not in the sense of forcing yourself to be open, but in the sense of not automatically closing. You begin to experiment. Small adjustments. You say one thing slightly more directly than you normally would. You stay present one moment longer than feels comfortable. You let a reaction show without immediately correcting it. Not everything, just enough. And what you start to notice is this: the moment does not collapse. The interaction does not break. The other person does not disappear. In fact, sometimes something unexpected happens. The interaction deepens, not dramatically, but noticeably. There is a shift, a response that wasn't there before, a level of engagement that feels different, more real, and more importantly, you feel it, not as intensity, as contact. Something reached you, and you didn't filter it out. That is the beginning of reconnection, not a breakthrough, a reversal. You are slowly undoing a pattern that learned to stay protected, and this process is uneven. There will be moments where you revert, where you close again, where you default back to control. That is not failure. That is the pattern doing what it was built to do. The difference now is that you can see it, and once you can see it, you can interrupt it. Not completely, but gradually. And as this continues, another shift happens. Your internal experience expands. You feel more variation, more depth, more response. Not all of it comfortable. Some of it unfamiliar. Some of it inconvenient, but real. And that matters more. Because connection is not built on comfort. It is built on contact. And contact requires exposure. Not full exposure, not reckless openness, but enough that something in you is actually present, and something in the other person has something real to meet. This is where the work becomes clear. It is not about becoming more social. It is not about forcing vulnerability. It is about restoring access to your own reactions, your own feelings, your own presence, and allowing those things to exist in the same space as other people, without being immediately managed, without being reduced, without being replaced by something safer. Because the more you do that, the more the structure begins to loosen, and the distance you've been maintaining starts to collapse. Not all at once, but enough that something new becomes possible, and that leads to the final shift. Not in behavior, but in how you understand what loneliness actually is and what it was pointing to all along. You thought this was about being alone, about needing more people, more connection, more depth in the world around you. But that was never the center of it. The loneliness wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from a distance you learned to maintain, a way of being present without ever fully arriving. And once you see that, something changes, not dramatically, but irreversibly, because you can no longer interpret the feeling the same way. That quiet emptiness is no longer vague. It is specific. It is the signal of where you are not entering your own life, where you are managing instead of participating, where you are observing instead of being affected. And once that becomes visible, you begin to notice it everywhere. In conversations, in silence, in small decisions, in the moments where something real tries to surface, and you instinctively reach to adjust it. You see the pattern, not as something abstract, as something immediate, something happening in real time. And that awareness does something subtle. It removes the illusion that this is just how things are, that this is just adulthood, just personality, just the way you function. You begin to see that it is structured, learned, maintained, which means it can also be changed. Not quickly, not completely, but gradually, through attention, through allowing, through staying present one moment longer than you usually would, and that is enough. Because the goal is not to eliminate the distance entirely. The goal is to stop living inside it without noticing, to stop organizing your life around avoiding contact, to stop calling disconnection normal, and instead, to recognize each moment where you are either entering or stepping away. There is no final version of this. No point where everything becomes fully open, fully connected. That's not how it works. There is only a continuous choice, subtle, moment to moment, to be slightly more present than before, to allow slightly more of yourself to exist without control, to let something real move through you instead of managing it away. And if you begin to do that, even in small ways, something shifts. Not in your circumstances, in your experience of them. The same conversation feels different. The same interaction carries more weight. The same moment reaches you in a way it didn't before, because you are finally there for it. Not perfectly, but enough. And that is the difference. Not between loneliness and connection, but between absence and presence. So the next time that quiet feeling appears, don't explain it away. Don't distract from it. Don't label it too quickly. Just notice it, exactly as it is. And ask a more precise question. Not, why am I alone? But, where am I not fully here?